you would bow with me. God our Father, as we go into this time this morning where we focus in on your word, I pray that you'll use me to speak the truth, that you show us who you are as clearly as we can see you, that we're never deceived by our own limitations into thinking that there is not an absolute truth to who you are and the plans that you have for our lives. God, keep us all humble. God, I pray that you're glorified in this message and the rest of our service this morning. In your Son's name, amen. It's been an interesting week. I said some about it to a few people this morning. Um, so I can say that this is the first time I will ever preach a sermon as an official Harding School of Theology scholar. So I have the added weight of representing the school well. But if I don't, remember, I'm only 1 week into classes, okay? And things got really interesting this week because on Friday, after a short conversation with Dr. Lance Holly, who was my Isaiah professor for the first week, he advised me to drop Isaiah and switch into his hardest class, his own words, Hebrew. Because if I didn't, I was going to extend my school out an entire year. So in the middle of the day Friday, while I was just finishing my work for Isaiah, by the way, I found out that I had to drop that class, try to go get the books for Hebrew, which were not available in the library. So I had to run to Cersei on Friday evening to make sure that I had the books so I'd be prepared to try to catch up 2 weeks with the rest of the class. So I've got quizzes. I'm expected to be able to read names in Hebrew tomorrow. I don't know the alphabet yet, okay? So this morning, if at a certain point I get a little scattered, this is why. Like, it's been that kind of a week. But what will you do at the end of it? It seems like a good way to start a sermon, right? The end of it. It's a question that I'll admit to you, reading it even without its context, it has this haunting appeal to me. I was almost fascinated with the wording of it. That's from the CSB, or the Holman Christian Standard. What will you do at the end of it? It's a question that God asks his people in Jeremiah chapter 5. And it's the kind of question that can just hang in the air. It can linger if it doesn't have any kind of resolution. You see, we don't like endings. How many of us would say that we do? You like endings, right? Most of us don't, right? We don't. Whether we think about it or not, at the end we find the unknown. We hate the unknown, right? And we need something to fill that uncomfortable void for us. We'll hold on to meaningless and unfulfilling jobs because what if we can't find anything better, right? I'm not talking to you, Anthony. I thought you might hear me say that and think I'm trying to prompt you to go quit your job. I'm not. I'm just making a point, okay? We'll hold on to relationships that are not good for us, that are inappropriate, that are abusive, that are even sinful. We'll hold on to those because what if no one else will ever love us? We don't even handle happily ever after very well, right? How many bad sequels have you sat through just because we couldn't let a story end? As Cameron's been preaching to us in this sermon series on God's mission, we recognize that it has a definite beginning in creation and a definitive end, at least in a sense, to God's new creation. I hope and pray that in this sermon series, we're seeking and finding our place and purpose in the midst of the elements of this mission as we try to figure out what it means to be a part of that, not just as individuals, but as Tyler read for us, as living stones, a spiritual house being built to be a holy priesthood to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. The prophet Jeremiah was called to his part in God's mission to Judah during the reign of the young king Josiah, during a time of upheaval with frequently shifting power struggles, a sea of just violence. You see, Judah and Israel had lost their freedom and they were subjected to these cruel empires. The time of Jeremiah was one in which the past, the present, and the immediate future all looked incredibly bleak. You see, Assyria, cruel as they were the now, but Babylon was coming. With Babylon, exile, the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple itself that God had protected for so long, all these things just over the blood-soaked horizon. Jeremiah has this incredibly difficult task of going out amongst these people that will not accept what he has to say. And I'll come back to that, but you can see it very clearly in the first chapter of Jeremiah. But I want to go to chapter 5. Starting in verse 24, I'm going to summarize for you basically 24 to 29, where it says that the people have turned aside and gone away from God out of their stubborn and rebellious hearts. They've forgotten the fear of the Lord and so turned to disobedience. They've forgotten his goodness, and now they're seeking to reward themselves with all the desires of their hearts by any means necessary. And in the process, they're leaving behind the most vulnerable people, the fatherless, the poor, the widowed. The 5th chapter of Jeremiah ends like this. It says, "An appalling, horrible thing has taken place in the land. The prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests rule by their own authority. My people love it like this. But what will you do at the end of it?" There's something to me really chilling about the shift at the end there. I don't know if it strikes you the way it does me, but all of a sudden, it's not my people anymore. It's not Judah. It's not Israel. It's not they. It's not them. It's you. What will you do at the end of it? After all of your wickedness and all of your greed, when you've gained the whole world and it's all come crumbling down on you, what will you do at the end of it? Doctors do a lot of weird stuff, right? We can all agree to that. Doctors, we allow to do things that we would not allow anybody else to do to us. Okay? You know that's true, but you may not think about it. When you take it out of its context, it makes a lot more sense. If, say, after church this afternoon, I were to go have lunch at Russell and Brenta's house, not that I was invited, because I wasn't. Not that I'm saying I should have been, but I should have. Okay? But if I went over to the Joy's house for lunch and I knock on the door and let's say Brenta opens the door with a big smile on her face and she says, come in, and she points me to a scale up against the wall, right? Or Russell comes over with a Q-tip and jams it halfway up my nose to my brain and then starts twirling it around, right? Or even better, we sit down for lunch and Brenta comes out with a syringe and says, I need some of your blood, right? For the sake of censoring myself to better suit a sermon for a Sunday morning, there you go. We let doctors do and take things far stranger than that to us, right? We've all been subject to the cruelty of the doctor in one way or another. They ask invasive questions. They want to do invasive tests. They want to suggest things that I'm not really comfortable with. And okay, look, you guys can see me. I'm a big guy, okay? I can't hide it. So what do you think the most uncomfortable thing for me when I go to the doctor is? Is the very first thing they're going to ask me to do after the paperwork. They're going to get me back there and point me to a scale. The doctor wants to know my weight. He wants to know my height. He wants to know my BMI, right? That's a little forward, okay? If you were to ask me for that information, I'd go so far as to say that was a little rude. I might call it offensive, right? And then after he finds all these things out about me, he's probably going to want to talk to me about hypertension, right? And blood sugar and cholesterol, the nerve. He might suggest that there's something wrong with me. How dare he? He might even say that there are things that I need to do and change about myself to be healthy. Who does he think he is? So why do I put up with it? Why do I tolerate the awkwardness, the discomfort, sometimes even the pain? I put myself in those situations. Why do I allow myself to be completely vulnerable to the point of even putting my life in the hands of a doctor? Many of us have done it. Cameron did it on Thursday morning. We talked about it just a little bit before he went through it. But, there's really something to putting your life in the hands of a doctor, even for something routine. I'm going to stick a sharp object into you. I am then going to pump something into you that is going to put you to sleep chemically. You have no real confidence that you're going to wake up from that other than your confidence in the doctor himself. Why do it? Because I understand the stakes, and the stakes make it worth it. Because what I endure at the doctor's hands is generally better than the alternative, right? I want to go back to Jeremiah to chapter 6. In Jeremiah chapter 6, verses 13 and 14, God is speaking again about the false prophets and the self-seeking priests, and he says this: "From the least to the greatest, all are greedy for gain. Prophets and priests alike all practice deceit. They treat the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace." The people are spiritually dying. They are wounded. They are crushed under the weight of their sins. But the prophets and the priests, those with the sacred responsibility of tending to the people in line with the law and the heart of God, they've lost sight of all that's at stake. Now they're passing out Band-Aids and saying all better. But how do we get here? How does it end up this way? Here I think you have to go back to Isaiah, because before Jeremiah there was Isaiah, a prophet that I now have a very complicated history with. But we're going to go back to Isaiah chapter 30, verses 8 through 11, because we typically tend to place the first 39 chapters of Isaiah right before the time of Jeremiah. So there in Isaiah chapter 30, starting in verse 8, it says, "Now go write it before them on a tablet and inscribe it in a book, that it may be for the time to come as a witness forever. For they are a rebellious people, lying children, children unwilling to hear the instruction of the Lord, who say to the seers, 'Do not see,' and to the prophets, 'Do not prophesy to us what is right. Speak to us smooth things. Prophesy illusions. Leave the way, turn aside from the path, and let us hear no more about the Holy One of Israel.'" Verse 11 there, I prefer, it's going to be on the next slide, the NIV version, where it says, "Leave this way, get off this path, and stop confronting us with the Holy One of Israel." Until you get into the actual chain of Hebrew words there, it can be hard to see how you'd come to different wordings like this. There are a number of different ways to translate it. All come to the same basic conclusion, but you'll notice different implications. I think this one is good because in the middle of that phrase in Hebrew, there's this word panem, which means basically to face. So they're saying the prophets and the priests are facing us, confronting. That's where we get the word, right? But if we were to take this and boil it down into a fairly accurate modern interpretation of what verse 11 says there, the people say, "Get off this path, leave this way, and get God out of our face." That's what they're saying. Get God out of our faces. It's not something that we want to look at. So over the course of this year, I started collecting VHS tapes, okay? And some of you need to work on your poker faces, because some of you just showed me how weird you think I am. for collecting VHS tapes. That's okay. That's okay. In the process, I've met some really interesting people, you can imagine, right? I've got people over in Searcy already at Books by the Pound who set back VHS tapes for me to go look through. I made a friend, you could say, in Olive Branch, a guy named Ronald. He's about my age, and he's moving across town. And so, about a month ago now, maybe a little more, I met him first through Facebook Marketplace. We started talking, and he was explaining to me because he was moving, he had to sell the vast majority of his VHS tape collection because he just couldn't carry it with him, didn't have the space. I went through, saw what he had, bought a little box, about 10 tapes maybe, but we exchanged information. And about a week ago, Ronald reached out to me and he said, "Hey, I just wanted to offer you some VHS tapes I'm trying to get rid of for free," in all capital letters, free. So, of course, I go to pick it up, and it turns out to be over 200 VHS tapes. It was a little more than I expected. But in the process, we started talking about one of the local thrift stores in Olive Branch. It's run by a Christian organization that also runs a women's shelter. And Ron said about that place, "I like that place, but the owner is a Christian nut. There's nothing wrong with the Christian faith, but with this lady, it's like it's do or die." So let me interpret that for you. Ronald's point of view is there's nothing wrong with the Christian faith until you actually believe it. The problem is I don't know if we all exactly believe it. And I'll come to that. But what we find at the core of his problem with Christianity is common for those outside of the church, and it's creeping into the church. There's something that's very deeply rooted in most of us that makes us desperately want to believe in the false gospel of human goodness. Okay? We want to believe not just in our goodness, but also in the goodness of those around us, directly opposite to what we're taught in Scripture. I remember in school reading the diary of Anne Frank. Anybody read it? Okay. There was a quote. It's the only one I remember taking away from the book, but we focused on it quite a bit, where she makes this emotionally resilient statement, and she says, "It's really a wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals because they seem so absurd and impossible to carry out. Yet I keep them because in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." What an inspirational statement, we all said, sitting around our tables in Mrs. Avant's gifted English class. What an inspiration to us all. That Anne, while Nazi Germany and a world at war around her proved that she was wrong, she held on to this idea that somehow, on our most fundamental level, human beings are intrinsically good. We can kind of come to that conclusion ourselves. Most of us do to one degree or another, and it's dangerous. And the way that we can do it is because we operate according to, Adam, I know this next slide is probably really interesting to look at, so I'll give you the key here. We like to operate on the basis of comparison. Go ahead and click it for me, Adam. Okay. That's my daughter. I know you can't see her actual head, but this was her yesterday. I was working on finalizing the sermon, and she took a mannequin head, stuck it in the top of her hoodie, and then decided to peek in just to get me, okay? Point being, my daughter is weird, okay? She's strange, but she loves TLC. She likes watching the shows on TLC, and I cleared this with her. I'll let everybody know it. She's not surprised by this. She was laughing before it came up. But she watches TLC, I think, in part because she can look at people and say, "See, at least I'm not addicted to eating sheetrock. At least I don't own 58 hairless rats, right? At least I don't think that Ferris wheel is my boyfriend." right? It's comparison, right? And I could sit down with her and I could watch TLC alongside her and I could binge watch my 600-pound life and convince myself that I'm skinny. Okay. But to do it, I would have to show a real lack of self awareness and no true concern for my well being. All that said, I'm not trying to make light of anybody's struggles. I don't know. The eating sheetrock, I feel like we can make fun of that at least a little bit. Let me take it down another degree. How often do we see the wickedness of man on the news? Especially where we live. We are completely inundated with stories that evidence the wickedness of man. But it's very easy for us to look at those stories and say, see, that's what evil looks like. Anybody ever played the Florida Man game? Anybody know what that is? Okay, a few people. So the Florida Man game is basically where you put Florida Man and your birth date into Google and find out what crazy Florida men have done criminally on those days. And trust me, your birthday will be represented one way or the other. Just to show you that Florida doesn't have a monopoly on wild crime, and because it's one of my favorite news articles of all time, and I promise you it's real. I got this particular iteration from USA Today. This is from April 2019, before the pandemic, when the world was sane. Okay? In a strange twist of events, a mother allegedly performed karate, a son stripped nude, and their dog stole cornbread this week at a Wisconsin Walmart, police said. The incident happened Wednesday evening when Eau Claire, Wisconsin police responded to a theft call at the store, the department said in a Facebook post. Police found a woman identified as, we'll just call her Lisa, I want to protect her a little bit, 46, chasing her dog Bo in the entry when they arrived and learned that son Benny, 25, was in the store as well. The woman allegedly arrived at the store with the pet unleashed and had been pulling apart store displays and placing them in her cart, the department said. She was asked to leave by staff and left the store to perform karate moves in the parking lot, the department said in the Facebook post. In the meantime, Bo got a box of Jiffy cornbread muffin mix and tried to leave the store. As the chaos ensued, police said Van, again, this is the son, went to the back of the store where he removed all of his clothing and exposed himself to other customers. The man grabbed new clothes from the store and tried to run over an officer with a scooter before he was arrested, police say. Smith was also, I gave his last name. He was also arrested but fought with officers, police say. Both faced several charges related to the incident, including disorderly conduct. As for the dog Bo, this being my favorite part, officers caught him and brought him to the Humane Association. The dog was not charged. We issued him a warning for the theft, the department said on Facebook. Now, I really enjoy a story like that because comparatively, it's way better than the alternatives. I mean, there's some gray area in there. Is pulling apart a store display really sinful? I guess it depends on how you did it, right? Just because they stack the cans up doesn't mean I can't take some of them. Is performing karate moves in the parking lot sinful? Probably not, I don't think. The dog doesn't know what he's doing. The son probably does. But I look at things that are far worse, and so by comparison, this is laughable. But the world is overrun with unchecked sin. And we can minimize some of it by comparison. At least they didn't find a body in the trunk. At least, but it's all sin, and all of it breaks the law of God. The way that Paul would say it, as soon as we break one part, we've broken the whole thing, which means that all of it, in that sense, is equal. Like all of it breaks God's law and separates us from Him. It's the place where we find commonality. But comparing myself to others is how I often find myself falling in line with the false gospel of human goodness. And so I've got 4 things that we're going to bring up about the ways that it manifests itself. And the first one is it suggests that the gap between God and man is really not that far. And the reason that this one is so interesting is because that idea can go completely different directions. I would say that the Pharisees fell in line with this way of thinking, right? They were able to justify themselves according to their own actions and say, we're not far from God. We look at the story that Jesus tells about the tax collector and the Pharisee, where the Pharisee stands and says, at least I'm not him. And yet him, Jesus says, is the one who walks away justified because of something that we're going to come back to when we go back to Isaiah chapter 30. But on one end, we have the Pharisees, we have legalism, we have this idea that somehow our merits can earn us salvation because the gap's not that big, right? On the other end, if the gap is really not that big, then there's probably multiple means to get to God. So we can go a number of ways wrong with this idea. The biggest one, though, that I want to make sure, I've been talking with the kids about it on Sunday. I think we might have talked about it the first time last Sunday. Any inclination that I have toward the idea that my deeds can get me there, the focus of that kind of faith is based only on one thing, that being salvation. For the Pharisees, their faith revolved around salvation. That's where it began, that's where it ended. Chosen people working toward salvation. The reason that that's dangerous is because it has me only asking the question, will this lead me to salvation or will this not lead me to salvation? Where if we go back to what we've been talking about, the beginning of God's story is creation, the end of God's story is new creation, and the entire story leads not just to my salvation, but ultimately even my salvation leads to the purpose of proving the glory of God. So the question that I ask myself, if I want a mature faith that keeps me humble in relation to God, is not, will this lead to my salvation or will this not lead to my salvation? It's, will this glorify God? Because that's the beginning of the story. That's the end of the story. Everything in between, every part of it, is meant to lead to the glorification of God the Father. Second, if the gap between me and God is not that big, then at most, all I need is maybe a little course correction. Maybe just a little leg up, right? And that's really just an extension of the first thing. But this is how God becomes my life coach, okay? This is how God becomes the supplement that I take standing in front of the bathroom mirror, right? This is how God becomes easily compartmentalized to Sunday morning and doesn't extend through the rest of the week. Go back to Isaiah, go back to Jeremiah, and see what God has to say about Sunday morning sacrifice when the rest of the week doesn't line up. He has no interest. None at all. The life that I live Monday to Saturday is the sacrifice and the worship that he wants, not the fact that I'm here right now. Doesn't mean it's not a part of it. It's just not the focus. This is about what we expect from God rather than how we view ourselves. But the third thing suggests that what we need is emotional uplifting and affirmation. We may not put it into those words, right? But we've definitely seen what Christian faith looks like when it's focused on affirming and being uplifting of self rather than being convicting and focusing on the transformation that we find in relationship with God. See, at this point, this is where we start to really, really love the Jesus that eats with tax collectors and sinners, with drunks and with ladies of questionable employment. We love that part of Jesus, but not as much do we love the part where Jesus says, go and sin no more. We love the Jesus that says, I don't condemn you either, though we might leave out that he says, then go and sin no more. He calls everyone to him not because he's trying to be inclusive, not because he's trying to be on the right side of a social argument or a political stance. Sometimes when we say things like Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners, we forget that that was an accusation made against him by the Pharisees. And guess what? He ate with them too. He ate with everybody because he wanted to welcome them into a place where they could be radically changed in relationship with him. There was a quote along these lines that I picked up from an author named Shane Claiborne from his book, Irresistible Revolution. He says, in our culture of seeker sensitivity and radical inclusivity, the great temptation is to compromise the cost of discipleship in order to draw a larger crowd. With the most sincere hearts, we don't want to see anyone walk away from Jesus because of the discomfort of his cross, so we clip the claws on the lion a little. We clean up a little bit of the bloody passion we're called to follow. In that book, Shane Claiborne would remind you that when Jesus spoke to a rich young ruler, he told him that where he was in his heart wasn't good enough. And he asked him to give up just a little bit more. And he said the rich young ruler walked away. And it says that it hurt Jesus because he loved him. But in his love, he didn't widen the goalposts. He didn't chase after him to try to change the nature of the relationship to make it palatable to him. God is who God is. Which gets to number 4. According to the false gospel of human goodness, God becomes subject to my concept of goodness. We see it constantly. An interesting quote that I heard came from Jonathan Stormont. He is the minister at the Pleasant Valley Church in Little Rock, and he has been a speaker every year that we've gone to Uplift. And I recently heard him say that over the last 10 years of his ministry, this is the road that people follow to walk away from their Christian faith. He said most of the people that he has known who walked away from their Christian faith, that journey started from one step, and it was the step that says human beings are basically good. Because as soon as I conclude that, there are a lot of things that don't make sense. If human beings are good, and then what we do is we conflate our concept of good with innocent, how could God ever condemn anyone? And now God is evil. Just like that. As soon as I conclude that man is good, God isn't. Because he doesn't line up with me. Meanwhile, the Bible says, and this is, I think this next slide is the last one. Because this is what happens when you switch from Isaiah to Hebrew on Friday. And so I've got more sermon than I've got slides, but don't worry, I'm bringing it to a close. We want so desperately to believe that humanity is good, but we see throughout our history that we are not. We can only come to the conclusion when we draw comparisons between ourselves and others, when we compare sins one to another. Meanwhile, Scripture says, Psalm 14, verse 3, all have turned away, all have become corrupt. There's no one who does good, not even one. There's a rhetorical question that gets asked in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 9, where it says, who can say, I've kept my heart pure, I am cleansed from my sin? Anybody want to raise their hand? Right? Oh, I got one, but I don't think he knew what he was saying. That question carries the same rhetorical force that Jesus delivers when he says to a group of people surrounding a sinful woman, the one of you without sin, feel free to throw the first stone. I wouldn't doubt that that verse came to people's minds because of how prevalently the Psalms and the Proverbs were used amongst the Jewish people. For me to believe that I'm good in any sense is directly oppositional to the Word of God. And beyond that, the bigger problem is it immediately trivializes who God is. I know that Patrick had no idea what I was talking about this morning, but as soon as he got up and he started talking about the tearing of the veil and the holiness of God, he didn't know this is where the sermon was going, but here we are. We could go back to chapter 30 in Isaiah, and we could look again closely at that verse 11 where it says, leave this path, leave this way, and get God out of our face. Stop confronting us. But the term, the name used for God there and 25 other times in Isaiah is the Holy One of God. It's used 26 times in Isaiah across 66 chapters, but interestingly, it's used 3 times right there in chapter 30 in that context, where the people say, we do not want to be confronted with the holiness of God. And Isaiah's immediate response is, this is what the Holy One of God says. The question that we have to ask ourselves, and I'd call your mind back to what Tyler read from us from 1 Peter chapter 2. If we are indeed a holy nation and priesthood, then we have a responsibility to take God out into the world with us. And too often, what we do is as soon as we fall victim to the idea that's most prevalent in our culture today, that the number one offense that anyone can commit is offense itself, we start to tailor God to the listener. And by the time we're done working that out, we're not presenting them with the image of God. We're just holding up a mirror because we know they'll like it. We've compromised the Holy One of God. Isaiah never suggests, and Jeremiah never suggests, that the people stopped going to the temple, that the people stopped giving sacrifice, that they stopped following the tenets of the law, but what they lost was God's heart. So let me not rob it of its context in either Jeremiah or Isaiah. Both, God boils things down, as I said, to this. You have forgotten the cause and the case of the poor, the fatherless, and the widows. Whatever it is we pursue in our pursuit of God, number one, it needs to be the absolute truth of God. As soon as I limit God to my ability to understand him, he is a God of my own creation. He's God made in my own image rather than me being man made in his. I know that this type of sermon is not the most cheerful. That's why I tried to throw a couple laughs in there for you, just to try to keep you above water a little bit. But this is so desperately needed today. Look around. Our culture has not changed. Not from Isaiah to Jeremiah, from Jeremiah to Paul, from Paul to now. We still have people saying, get God out of our face unless he looks like we want. Right? And then we've come to this conclusion that if I go out and I preach the message of God, of Scripture, and it offends someone, then I have in some way made a mistake. When the message is consistent, go to Jeremiah chapter 1, like I said, and see how many times God says to Jeremiah, don't be terrified of these people. Look at how many times he says, don't be afraid. They're not going to accept you. They're not going to listen to what you have to say. Didn't Jesus say something like that to his disciples? Didn't he have a few things to say about knocking the dust off their sandals in those places when people would not hear the good news? I wonder if it was because they were too offensive. Or I wonder if it's more in line with what Peter said, where we read about this cornerstone. The weight of the whole building lies on him, and yet he's also referred to as a stumbling block or a rock of offense. He goes back to Psalms and Isaiah to pull those quotes in. You cannot remove the offense of the gospel unless you remove Jesus. Jesus said to his disciples, if they hate you, just remember they hated me first. If you find yourself in a place in your Christian walk where people love you for your Christianity, you've either surrounded yourself with the right kind of people who are building up your faith, or your faith looks too much like the world. Because Jesus himself said, if you were of the world, they would love you, but they don't love you because you come from me. My question is, whatever choice you make, wherever you stand right now, what will you do at the end of it? Will you seek out smooth words, flattery? Will you then turn and present that to people around you and bring them in relationship to a God who is not holy? We can easily do that because the world around us wants the hope of God, but they don't want the holiness. Our God has not changed. The holy God of the Old Testament was called the Holy One of God in the New Testament when he walked the earth, and he has not changed. We respect that holiness both in the words that we ascribe to here, not looking at God through the keyhole for the parts of him that we want to see clearly, but opening the door to the Jesus who says, here I stand and knock. But for me to take him, I have to take him on the whole. I have to open the door. I have to let him in for everything that that means and all that he is, and I don't get to shape him. He wants to shape me. This morning, I'd offer the invitation. Whatever need you may have, this is a giving church. It really is. I've received so much from this church, just being here. I told somebody the other day, I've been here now, I think it'll be 6 years, Thanksgiving, that my family has been here. And I knew when I got here how much I needed to heal, but I didn't know exactly how much I needed to heal. I had that feeling within me that I needed something different, that I needed a change, that I needed to find a family of Christian people who loved me, and I found it here. And starting school again and going into this endeavor, I have found new depths to the places where I still need that healing. And so I go back time and time again with the help of this body of believers to the Holy One of Israel, the only one I should ever compare myself to. If you have not put on Christ, if that faith and that pledge of a good conscience in baptism isn't something that you've committed yourself to, you have that opportunity this morning. If you've done that, but you've started to compromise yourself, if you need encouragement, if you need comfort, if you need prayers that have nothing to do with anything said this morning, all these things are welcome, and we'd ask that you come as we stand and we sing.